That's Tron. He fights for the users.
Hello there, and welcome once again. Well, today in England it is pissing down, as they say. What have I got today? Talking about ancient schools, Gurdjieff once described Christianity as a school of repetition. An interesting phrase, and I noticed that Julius Evola had said something similar, so I will read them out together later on. And I wanted to talk about nursing and the knowledge lines that travel through women in society. But to begin with, let's return to Gurdjieff, discussing the braiding and unbraiding of the three holy forces within us. In truth, these three-brained beings of your planet had in the beginning existed according to their time calculations for about 12 centuries, and some of them for about 15. To be able more or less clearly to represent to yourself the rate at which the length of their existence declined during this time, it is enough for you to know that when I left this solar system, the maximum length of their existence was already from 70 to 90 of their years, and latterly, if anybody should exist as long as this, all the rest of the beings of that peculiar planet would already consider that he had existed quite decently long, while if anybody happened to exist a little over a century, he would be exhibited in their museums, and of course all the rest of the beings there would know about him, because his photographs and descriptions of the manner of his existence, even to the enumeration of each of his movements, would constantly be published in all their what are called newspapers. Well, I was watching a man that I know who has gone back to nature and leads a rustic life in a log cabin in Canada. He was talking about longevity this week as him and his wife are getting older, but for him that means taking special genetic supplements and various ideas from the Americana of today. Modern people know nothing else. If we were to live again to 1200 years, something very fundamental would have to change inside of us that we do not suspect. Isn't it strange how Gurdjieff's ideas of the three holy forces and the three centers barely appear in any religious or spiritual traditions that can be seen? People talk of emptiness, of the chakras, of devotion to God, but in fact the three centers or the three minds which exist within us are even closer to our identity than our breathing, and so seem to be unknown. The fallen man that we are is a braided rope that has come undone at one end, and the fraying strands which hold the energy of the mental, emotional and physical parts of us bleed into the wrong work and fantasies of the many eyes. They are the many eyes, and become an open drain of our fundamental energies that leak in meaningless, unproductive work, shortening our lives at each step. Gurdjieff did not exactly fall over himself to make things easy for his students, and worldwide his students seem to not have picked up their cross. What I understand comes only from my cross-training in the Indian and Chinese arts. Okay then, well, let's talk a little bit about nursing. When I was young, one of our dogs, Fluffy, developed a distinct interest in my ankles that was not according to law, as Gurdjieff would have said. And I ended up here at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington many times, and emptied their reserves of tetanus inoculations. And in those days the corridors were empty, quiet, and peaceful, with an occasional nurse, matron or doctor walking quietly through the halls. It was a lot like a church, really. What to say about this photo? So many things are conveyed. A people, a culture, service, and yes, a line of knowledge, a line of light from the center, on the female side of society, just as there is on the masculine side, as there always is. Here, within the umbrage of our arms, close to us, everything is learned. The three-centeredness that Gurdjieff talked about, the meeting of our physical life, our emotional life, and our mind working together towards an aim, towards doing our rounds in the 2 wards before lunchtime, towards feeding all the patients and clearing up the lunch before the next shift starts, towards making sure all the younger nurses have what they need, and the older ones as well. This close sphere, the daily bread of our work, is where objectivity is learned, is where reality is learned. As Gurdjieff would say, seeing how things ought to be done, choosing how things should be done, the work of a man. And if reality is not learned here, within the span of your arms, then it is not learned anywhere. But of course in our society, as if floating above us are all the fantastic ideas of the modern society, the management and the health and safety guidelines and the procedures and everything that robs the contact of the man and the world, the man and his work, the man and his life, interfering and interfering and interfering until work is barely possible, until work is about surviving that horrendous interference that trusts anything but the spirit inside of people. Yesterday I noticed that spending a long time on the internet I ceased to feel the soul of my friends and could only see their bodies. When you think about people, what is it that you know about them? You feel their field of energy. You know their feelings and their eyes and their glances. And that is what you mean when you talk about your friends. But in our society, people are always bleeding into their phones, into their fantasies, and then afterwards there is no subtlety in your feeling of life. And for such people nothing can be explained because there's not much left. There are no feelings left to speak to. Let's move now to the idea of the sacred schools of repetition that both Gurdjieff and Julius Evola had mentioned. Gurdjieff says, "The Christian church, the Christian form of worship, was not invented by the fathers of the church. It was all taken in a ready-made form from Egypt, only not from the Egypt that we know, but from one which we do not know. This Egypt was in the same place as the other, but it existed much earlier. Only small bits of it survived in historical times, and these bits have been preserved in secret, and so well that we do not even know where they have been preserved. It will seem strange to many people when I say that this prehistoric Egypt was Christian many thousands of years before the birth of Christ, That is to say, that its religion was composed of the same principles and ideas that constitute true Christianity. Special schools existed in this prehistoric Egypt which were called schools of repetition. In these schools a public repetition was given on definite days, and in some schools perhaps even every day, of the entire course in a condensed form of the sciences that could be learned at these schools. Sometimes this repetition lasted a week or a month, and thanks to these repetitions, people who had passed through this course did not lose their connection with the school and retained in their memory all they had learned. These schools of repetition were taken as a model for Christian churches. The form of worship in Christian churches almost entirely represents the course of repetition of the science dealing with the universe and man. Individual prayers, hymns, responses, all had their own meaning in this repetition, as well as holidays and all religious symbols, though their meaning has been forgotten long ago. The idea was that, beginning with the first words, the liturgy, so to speak, goes through the process of creation, recording all its stages and transitions. Now, Julius Evola also talked about ancient Egypt and schools of repetition. He says, "A king, through his sacrifice, points the way that leads to Valhalla, namely, to the type of action that allows a person to partake of the heroic, aristocratic, and Uranian immortality. According to its original meaning, the sacrifice generates a god or hero, which is connected to a tradition centered on that particular god or hero. This repetition either renews the effective power of that god, or reproduces it and develops it within the order of a given community. In the Egyptian tradition, Osiris is believed to be the one who taught mankind how to perform rites, as well as the sacred art of temple construction. Osiris is also the god of rites, since he himself, first among the gods, went through the sacrifice and experienced death, he being the first to penetrate the unknown of the other world, and to his becoming a being who knows the great secret. Through death and rites, Osiris, the first among all beings, knew the mystery and a new life. This science and this life were the privilege of beings who were considered divine. Osiris was thought to have initiated both men and gods into sacred rituals. He had shown to beings who inhabit the heavens and earth how to become a god. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and went away. When the weeds sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, 'Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?' 'An enemy did this,' he replied. The servants asked him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?' 'No,' he answered, 'because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn